Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 43 of Dollar Dialogue podcast. Today's episode is a very interesting episode as today we are going to be talking about Big Brothers and their economies, which is a fan favorite. So, for today's Big Brothers, we have Pol Pot of Cambodia, Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, and Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan, whose economic decisions has left a profound mark on their nations. And while their political regimes are clearly marked by severe repression and human rights abuses, their economic policies has undeniably played a pivotal role in shaping the fates of their countries. And each one of these leaders, whether you like them or not, has employed distinct economic strategies, but all were driven by the desire to maintain control over their nations through economic manipulation, leading to long-term consequences, which has rippled through their societies still today. So, with that being said, today for our guest speaker, we have a very special guest speaker, Mr. Chanjoo Kim. I've known Mr. Chanjoo Kim since the past year, and he's an excellent student. He is currently he currently has the highest GPA in his class, and he's also the youngest NHS member in our school. So academically, Chanjoo is very gifted. But what he's more gifted is in the realm of politics and economics. Chanjoo is amazing at geography. You can probably point any country in the map and he'll tell you the capital. And obviously, he also knows a lot about the historical figures, which is why Chanjoo is currently willing to pursue history next year. And he is also willing to pursue economics because before our podcast today he was actually talking to me about the chaebols in South Korea and how they sort of have a monopoly over everything. So clearly he's very gifted academically, he's very gifted financially as well, and also very athletic. He's very good at football. So we're very happy to have Mr. Chanjoo Kim in the podcast today. Mr. Chanjoo Kim, would you like to add anything to the introduction that I've just stated?
Yes, yeah. Firstly, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and it is really a big honor for me to be part of this wonderful podcast discussion with amazing hosts of Dollar Dialogue. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chanjoo Kim, for the introduction. So, yeah, guys, let's get right into it. So, for today, we have the three big brothers. Firstly, we'll go in a chronological order. First, we'll start with Pol Pot. Then we'll go into Mobutu Sese Seko and Islam Karimov. So, first, I would like to talk a bit, give the audience a bit of an introduction about Pol Pot, who was the famous leader of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, and basically to give some introduction about Pol Pot from an economic standpoint as well as from a political standpoint. I would like to first mention about the genocide that happened during his regime, which saw the dismantling and the violent killings of the nation's previous economic and social structure. And this is probably one of the worst genocides that has happened in Southeast Asia's history. And clearly, Pol Pot was a very bad leader in terms of the fact that he killed around 2 million Cambodians. But firstly, I would like to talk about his economic policies in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge regime, which was, I believe, from 1975 to 1979, if I'm not mistaken. And it was very disastrously misguided and led to the collapse of the country's economy. And from an economic standpoint, the policies implemented during this period not only devastated the nation's infrastructure, but also resulted in catastrophic losses in terms of productivity, human lives, and long-term economic stability. So, firstly, I would like to talk about the agricultural output collapse. So, Pol Pot's radical attempt to transform Cambodia into a rural, self-sufficient agrarian society led to the abandonment of urban areas and forced relocation of approximately 2 million people into the countryside. And these individuals, many of whom were urban professionals with no agricultural experience, and they were sort of coerced into working on agricultural collective farms. And the immediate consequences of this shift was a sharp decline in agricultural productivity. And despite the Khmer Rouge's goal of increasing rice production, output plummeted and starvation became widespread. So by 1979, Cambodia's rice production had fallen by 50 to 70% compared to the pre-regime levels. And not only that, it also led to economic isolation. Under Pol Pot, Cambodia was sort of cut off from the global economy. The Khmer Rouge sort of abolished currency. They banned private enterprise, which effectively severed the country from both international trade and its own internal market. Foreign aid, which many of you might be aware of, for example, the US foreign aid, which had previously been a critical part of Cambodia's economy were also suspended. So, with the collapse of trade and industry, obviously the economy shrank dramatically, and the GDP in 1979, when the regime ended, as I was researching, was at least 75% lower than when it had been before the Khmer Rouge took over. So, clearly, the economic consequences of this was beyond disastrous for Cambodia. Other than that, I would also like to talk about the human cost of economic policies. The economic policies under Pol Pot directly contributed to the massive loss of life. Starvation, forced labor, and executions were rampant during this period. It is estimated that 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, which is basically effectively 25% of the population, died from malnutrition, overwork, or execution during the Khmer Rouge regime. So I remember in grade 8 under Mr. Renoso, we had during a social studies class, we were talking about the fact that all the smart people in during the Khmer Rouge regime, for example, if you wear glasses or spectacles, and if the representative of the Khmer Rouge regime, if they saw you in public, they would kill you just for wearing glasses, because people who wore glasses were traditionally considered to be like smart and well read because they wore glasses. So this perception of people wearing glasses sort of had them killed. So basically, if I were in Cambodia at this point in time during the Khmer Rouge, I would be killed as well. So that's how Pol Pot's regime was. He was absolutely a mad dictator with no clear economic incentive to move Cambodia forward, and he clearly had a very sort of close-minded view of how an economy should be run. So additionally, after the, as I was mentioning, the currency abolition and price controls, which were sort of unrealistic and unmanageable. And this led to famine and starvation. So, as a result of the drastic changes to the agricultural sector, combined with the forced collectivization and environmental factors, Cambodia experienced severe food shortages. So, around 3 million people had died due to famine, malnutrition, and disease. And these were clearly the consequences of Pol Pot's economic policies, which had decimated agricultural production and sort of disrupted the food distribution. So, after the fall of Pol Pot's regime in 1979, Cambodia faced a long and difficult path to economic recovery. The economy was essentially left in ruins, with the agriculture and industrial sector virtually non existent. And it took decades before Cambodia's GDP could show any meaningful growth again. And the nation's reliance on foreign aid was critical for construction efforts, but the long lasting effects of Pol Pot's economic policy sort of kept Cambodia among the world's poorest nations for many years after the regime. So clearly, Pol Pot's radical vision sort of ignored the realities of agriculture, industry, and trade, and the forced sort of collectivization, economic isolation, and the destruction of agriculture and mass purges not only decimated the Cambodian population but also like devastated the country's economy. And the long-term effects of these economic policies can still be felt today as Cambodia like continues to rebuild from the economic devastation caused by the Khmer Rouge regime. So, with that being said, would anyone else like to add anything to the brief introduction that I had stated about Pol Pot, Mr. Shazib Karim, Mr. Supreet Nagala, or Mr. Chanjoo Kim?
Thank you so much, Arif Malik, for such a detailed, though short and concise, it's a very detailed and mind boggling introduction to this dictator. So, when we talk about genocides and atrocities, we often frame them as the acts of isolated madmen, like monsters working alone. But history is really that simple. And Pol Pot, he wasn't acting in a vacuum. His rise and reign of terror were enabled not just by his ideology, not just by his followers, but by powerful nations who either looked the other way or actively helped him. Let's talk about China first. Maoist China was Pol Pot's ideological muse and his biggest backer. The Khmer Rouge shared China's revolutionary zeal, radical agrarian socialism, anti intellectualism, the rejection of Western influence, and Beijing loved it. They poured in funding, weapons, and military training. We're talking billions of dollars in support throughout the 1970s. And even after Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979 and exposed the full horror of the killing fields, China continued to support the Khmer Rouge, both militarily and diplomatically, because now it was about geopolitics. Vietnam had Soviet backing, so China propped up Pol Pot to oppose the Soviets. And human rights, well, they were all gone. But here's where the curveball comes in: the West, especially the United States. They also played a part. Not because they supported Pol Pot's ideology, hell no, but because they hated the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia even more. During the Cold War, it was all about the enemy of my enemy. So even after the world knew about the Khmer Rouge and what they had done, the US and its allies refused to recognize the new Vietnamese backed Cambodian government. Instead, they allowed Khmer Rouge representatives to keep Cambodia's seat at the United Nations until 1993. Let that sink in. So, on paper, the US was condemning genocide, but in practice, their actions helped legitimize the same regime that murdered nearly 2 million people. So here's what I want to ask you guys and throw to you guys. What's worse, supporting a genocidal regime because you share its ideology like China, or supporting it purely for political convenience like the West? And does that moral calculus actually matter to the people who end up suffering in the end?
Wow, Subrit, I like to applaud you for your insightful information, and yeah, you also asked a really good question. But and I would really like to answer the question. But before before answering your question, I'd just like to give a brief insights from my own perspective as well. So if you look at Pol Pot, so let me paint your picture. Like the moment Pol Pot's forces seized Phnom Penh, like Cambodia's capital, he ordered the entire population to evacuate. Yes, the entire city. So imagine millions forced into the countryside at gunpoint. Why? Because Pol Pot believed that cities were symbols of capitalist decay, and his dream was a classless, self-sufficient agrarian society. And um, this sounds romantic on paper to some radicals, but in practice, it was pure hell. Banks were abolished. The currency was useless. Private property was forbidden, and markets were non-existent. The entire economy was replaced by forced agricultural labor. You were assigned to a collective farm. Didn't matter if you were a doctor, a teacher, or a child. If you couldn't produce rice or build irrigation canals, you were a burden and often a target. Pol Pot's regime relied on fear, violence, and total economic control. There was no room for innovation, trade, or entrepreneurship. In fact, even speaking a foreign language could get you executed. Between starvation, overwork, and mass executions, nearly 2 million Cambodians died, roughly a quarter of the entire population. So now, answering your question, Supreet, I think that's a heavy but very important question, and it's we could really debate it, Supreet. But I think this usually like supporting genocide directly, like you had mentioned, Supreet, I think this usually comes from a place of ideological belief, a warped conviction that certain groups are a threat, inferior, or undeserving of existence. And this is horrifying because it reveals how far humans can go in service of an idea, no matter how evil. Because, for example, Pol Pot's belief that intellectuals and urban elites had to be eradicated to build an agrarian utopia, like Arib had previously mentioned. And, this was very extreme, but it was rooted in belief and, still results in massive human suffering. And um, I think, supporting genocide for political convenience, as Superior asked, this means that it's wrong, but you do it or tolerate it because it's useful. And it's about maintaining alliances, gaining resources, silencing dissent, or staying in power. And you know for example, governments that have backed regimes committing atrocities because they were strategic partners are useful against communism or terrorism. And um, like here you're trading human lives for short-term power, or or comfort, and pretending that it's okay. And I think both of them are very evil and wrong. But I don't know what to say. Like, in many ways, supporting genocide out of belief is just radical evil, and supporting genocide out of convenience is calculated evil. And in many ways, the second can be more chilling because it admits awareness and still chooses silence or complicity. And I was reading this book, and as philosopher Hannah Arendt once wrote, it's not just the monsters we should fear, it's the bureaucrats of evil who nod, stamp papers, and enable atrocities from a desk.
Thank you so much, Shazib, for such a interesting answer to my question. And Chanju, uh, what do you have to say? Definitely give your thoughts as well, and if possible, please answer my question as well. Thank you.
Okay, so before I answer to Supri's question, since I think there was lots of conversations about genocide, which is also called as killing fields, one of the most cruel genocide in the human history. I would like to talk about like Pol Pot's other policies and its impact on Cambodia's economy. So, firstly, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge viewed capitalism and industry as a corrupt and exploitative, leading them into dismantle all economic structures related to trade, finance, and manufacturing. So one of the Khmer Rouge's first acts was to eliminate Cambodia's currency, which was the real at the time, and as a consequence, banks were shut down, and their reserves were looted or destroyed, and people had no means of saving or exchanging value, making economic transactions impossible. Also, all forms of private businesses, from small shop to large enterprises, were banned, and markets, including food markets, were dismantled, and which forced people to depend on government-controlled rations. Trade with other countries was also almost entirely cut off, which could mean that Cambodia was isolated, and Cambodia was by itself. Yeah. So factories were closed as industrial production was seen as a part of corrupt bourgeois economy. Machinery and industrial equipment were left to rust or were repurposed for military use. And skilled worker and professionals were executed, as you said, due to killing fields and sent to labor camps and further crippling productivity. So I think the economic consequences of this destruction of industries were, without the trade or industry, Cambodia had technically no functioning economy. So the lack of currency made it impossible for people to obtain goods outside of this state-controlled system, and the country lost its ability to import their like its essential goods, including like medicines and machineries. So yeah, that's all for it.
Hmm. Thank you, Chandu, for your insights. And I'll set another question on Pol Pot and like this entire situation because it's like quite intriguing if you look at it. So my question is like, why do you guys think like why did the global community respond so slowly or not at all to Pol Pot's genocide?
Mr. Suprit Nagala, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to answer that question?
I mean, for sure. Okay, so the short answer, politics. And the long answer, geopolitical apathy. So it's like Cold War chess games and the world's habit of reacting to genocide only when it's too late. So let's break it down. The Khmer Rouge took power in 1975, as Arif already explained, and by 1977 to 78, mass atrocities were committed. But very few nations intervened. Why? Because this wasn't just a humanitarian issue, it was wrapped in the Cold War. For instance, Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, was the first to intervene. They invaded Cambodia in 1979, ousted Pol Pot, and installed a new government. But the West, especially the US and the Allies, they didn't want to support anything Vietnam was doing. So instead of supporting the effort to remove such a genocidal regime, they kept viewing it through a Cold War lens. And even after the genocide was widely known, the West and China continued to support the remnants of the Khmer Rouge, as I already explained before. And the UN, they themselves let Pol Pot's representatives hold Cambodia's seat, even after all of the mass executions, forced labor, and the thousands of people who died due to hunger. So let that sink in. The man who orchestrated one of the worst genocides of the 28th century was still represented diplomatically, while survivors were literally starving in refugee camps. And let's be real, Cambodia is, and not anymore, but was a small and quite a poor Southeast Asian country. It didn't have oil, it didn't have nukes, and it wasn't seen as a strategic priority unless it was tied to bigger powers. So that's why the world dragged its feet. We saw the same with Rwanda as well. We see it again and again every day. The international community is quick to say never again, but way too slow to say enough. So, as in essence, politics. Politics is the main reason as to why the global community responded so slowly and so like so carelessly to Pol Pot's genocide.
Thank you for answering my questions. That was really insightful. So, yeah, Arib, I'll hand it over to you unless like anyone else wants to answer my question. So yeah, Arib.
Yeah, everyone, thank you for the insight. So, yeah, I think Shazib asked a very good question. Geopolitics is obviously a very important issue in our times, and obviously, we don't want to get too political here. And like, Dollar Dialogue does not endorse any particular regime. So, but we do think that as a collectively, I think everyone can agree that the Pol Pot regime was clearly marked by terror, and whether or not United States intervened, that's based on their political standpoint, and like at that point in time, clearly the Cold War was going on. So even for example, in 1971, the United States particularly did not help Bangladesh as that much, even though we had like a sort of a genocide as well, and that's because of the political tensions during that time. So Cold War was, I think, a bigger issue, but that's a topic for another day. So I think the discussions about Pol Pot was very significant, I think. And so, do we guys unanimously agree that, or like, do you guys agree that Pol Pot's regime for Cambodia was marked by terror, and from an economic standpoint, it left Cambodia in a state of isolation, and also like disrupted the economy, which consequences can still be felt in the Cambodian economy today, as it's still a very poor country.
Most definitely, I do agree with you, Ari. But I also believe it's very important to also look at it through a humanitarian standpoint as well, and underscore the significance of Pol Pot's genocidal regime.
Yes, thank you for the agreement. So yeah, so moving on, I would like to now talk about Mobutu Sese Seko, who was the authoritarian leader of Zaire, but Zaire is currently known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Seko was the leader of Zaire from 1965 to 1997, and his was marked by economic mismanagement, rampant corruption, and an enduring legacy of poverty and instability in the country. And Mobutu is often cited as one of Africa's most notorious kleptocrats, having used the state's resources for personal gain while exploiting Zaire's vast mineral wealth. So, and kleptocrats are basically, like, the dictionary definition of it is a ruler who uses their power to steal a country's resources. So Mobutu was clearly a very notorious kleptocrat. And some of the points regarding Mobutu Seko's economic policy that I found through extensive research was the fact that Zairianism and economic nationalism was one of the fact. So one of Mobutu's earliest economic policies, which was initiated in the 1970s, is called Zairinization. And this policy aimed to transfer the ownership of foreign-owned businesses, especially in key sectors like mining and trade, to Zairian citizens. And while the policy was sort of framed as a way to promote national pride and economic independence, it was largely ineffective and often disastrous. And Mobutu and his allies seized foreign businesses and handed them over to politically connected Zairians who lacked the expertise to run them effectively. And the same thing sort of happened in Uganda, because there's a large diaspora of Indians who were living in Uganda. But after Idi Amin sort of took over Uganda, he sort of expelled the Indians who were sort of living there for second and third generations there, and he handed the businesses to the local Ugandans. But the problem was that local Ugandans had no sort of idea on how to run businesses, how to do accounting, bookkeeping, all those stuff. So clearly, the incompetence sort of led to the negative impact of Ugandan economy. And the same can be said about Zaire as well, because Mobutu's policy of Zaireanization sort of was lacking and was not well planned out, because the people were not sort of experienced, and this sort of incompetence led to economic stagnation, as formerly profitable industries like minerals collapsed under mismanagement. And for example, the mining sector, which was a critical part of the Zairian economy, experienced significant declines in productivity. And obviously, with that economic stagnation, it comes as no surprise that corruption and kleptocracy played a role. So Mobutu's role was probably, out of the three dictators that we have today, was probably the most that was marked by corruption. The regime, as I've mentioned before, operated under kleptocracy, where state resources were siphoned off for personal benefit of Mobutu and his inner circle. And Mobutu was known to have amassed an enormous fortune, with estimates suggesting that he personally controlled billions of dollars in foreign assets by the end of his rule. And he clearly ruled for a very long time, from 1965 to 1997. So clearly, during this time period, which is like almost 32 years, he had like amassed billions of dollars. And Mobutu's wealth was often hidden in foreign Swiss bank accounts. And he had a lavish lifestyle, including expensive palaces, luxury cars, and international properties. However, the problem with that is that kleptocracy often causes the nation's resources to deplete, and with that, a nation has to like rely on foreign aid and loans, and this is something that we learned in macroeconomics. So, despite his sort of anti-colonial rhetoric and efforts at economic self-sufficiency, Mobutu heavily relied on foreign aid and loans throughout his rule, and he was sort of able to secure substantial support from Western nations during the Cold War, particularly from the United States, which saw Mobutu as a strategic ally in the fight against communism in Africa. And the same can be said about Pinochet in Chile as well, who was sort of a dictator that was backed by the US, as he sort of supported capitalism. And I'm not going to comment on the USS like sort of whether it was good or bad, but clearly nations have their incentives, and I support US's incentive here, because the Cold War, each country had to take a side. So Mobutu was clearly backed by the US, if that makes sense, and his regime received large amounts of foreign aid, but instead of using it to develop the country, much of it was diverted into private accounts or used to maintain the regime's power. And this created a dependency on foreign aid, making the country economically vulnerable. And the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank also provided loans which were often misused or diverted into Mobutu's personal wealth. And as a result, the national debt of Zaire increased dramatically. So by the 80s and 90s, Zaire's economy was in free fall. The mismanagement of resources combined with the corruption and declining foreign aid led to widespread poverty, high inflation, and a decaying infrastructure. And the country's GDP per capita plummeted, and basic services like education, healthcare, and public transportation became nearly non-existent. So Zaire, which was once a major producer of minerals like copper, cobalt, and diamonds, saw its mining industry deteriorate as a result of neglect, mismanagement, and a lack of investment. And the lack of diversification in the economy also made it highly vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices. And to put this into perspective, Africa's like very rich in minerals. So the UAE, which is the United Arab Emirates, we like consider it as a beacon of like capitalism, wealth, and luxury. And obviously, people often think that it comes from oil money. And while that may be true, Nigeria has more oil than UAE can ever imagine. But look at the disparity between Nigeria and the UAE. And ultimately, it comes to the leadership. And the problem with Zaire's leadership was that Mobutu's regime was characterized by corruption and political repression as well. Political opposition was crushed, and any dissent was met with violence. And thousands of political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. And the country's press was tightly controlled. And the regime also maintained a cult-like personality around Mobutu, who portrayed himself as the father of the nation. He like established a personal brand of nationalism known as authenticity, which sought to erase the colonial influence by renaming the country Zaire and changing the names of cities and encouraging the use of African names and customs. And talking about legacy, Mobutu's rule left Zaire with a legacy of deep political and economic dysfunction. The wealth of the country was concentrated in the hands of the few, and the vast majority of Zairians lived in extreme poverty. So the collapse of the Zairian state in 1990s was accelerated by the First Congo War, which happened in 1996 to 1997, which saw Mobutu's regime toppled by the rebellion led by Laurent Desire Kabila, who would eventually become the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Mobutu fled to Morocco, where he died in exile in 1997. So Mobutu was sort of able to maintain relation with both the Western and Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. He was there was this non-aligned movement at that time, but Mobutu was sort of with the U.S. and the non-aligned movement. And despite his dictatorial rule and corruption, the U.S. and other Western nations continued to support him due to his anti-communist rhetoric. However, Mobutu's relationship with the foreign donors soured in the 80s and 90s as his regime became more entrenched in corruption and mismanagement. And the final years of Mobutu's rule saw declining international support and increasing economic political instability in Zaire. So, in conclusion, like we can see that Mobutu's economic policy were primarily focused on consolidating his power with little regard for long-term development of Zaire, and his personal focus on enrichment, coupled with his authoritarian governance, led to the destruction of the country's economy and its international sort of reputation, as Zaire sort of became known as like IMF beggar. So while Mobutu's rule initially brought some political stability to the country, it ultimately left Zaire in ruins with a broken economy, widespread poverty, and a collapsed infrastructure. So, with that being said, would anyone else like to add any insights to the information that I said about Mobutu Sese Seko, Mr. Shazib Karim, Mr. Suprit Nagala, or Mr. Chanjoo Kim?
Yeah, Mr. Arim Malik, thank you for that amazing introduction on Mobutu Sese Seko. And I would like to talk about his corruption and further the impact of that corruption. So one of the defining characteristics of Mobutu's rule was a state-sponsored corruption, which led to the widespread of embezzlement of national wealth. So Mobutu amassed an estimated 4 to 15 billion in personal wealth by looting the country's resources while the economy collapsed. His luxury lifestyles included multiple palaces, a fleet of private jets, and properties in Europe. And Mobutu borrowed heavily from Western countries, but used the money for personal gain rather than country's development, which led to economic collapse of the um, Zaire, also known as Democratic People's Democratic Republic of the Congo. Yeah, and yeah, by the 1980s, Zaire had over 10 billion dollar in foreign debt, making it one of the most indebted country in Africa. And the IMF and World Bank gave Zaire multiple bailout loans, but these funds were often misused or stolen by a corrupted official or Mobutu himself. Also, the Western government supported Mobutu for geopolitical reasons, as he was seen as the Cold War ally against the communism, which allowed him to continue his corruption. So, as an impact of his corruption and other policies, the economy shrank as industrial and agriculture output declined. In the early 1970s, GDP per capita was around $400, but by the 1990s, it had fallen to less than $100. But, also, by the 1990s, inflation had reached several thousand% per year, making money particularly worthless. This was because in the late 1980s, during the final days of his administration, he tried to prevent rising prices by implementing price control policies, but the policies failed, and hyperinflation occurred. And then I would like to ask a question to you guys about how, like, why do you think his effort on preventing rising prices by like implementing price control like policies, why do you think that failed in Zaire's society? Yeah.
Chanjoo, that's a really good question, and I also really appreciate your insights, Chanjoo. And before I answer your question again, just like yeah, adding on more insightful comments and my own perspective into the conversation, I'd say that um, like on paper, like we can talk about the like I don't know if you heard this. I think it's pronounced Zairaniization, which is like Mobutu's big economic move in the 1970s. And on paper, it was nationalist. He kicked out foreign business owners and handed over their assets to the Zairians, but not just any Zairians. His friends, family, his generals, and people with no clue on how to run an oil company, a coffee export firm, or even a bakery. And the result? It was disaster. Production collapsed, supply chains broke down, and inflation skyrocketed. Investors ran, and Mobutu, he kept cashing in. At one point, he was considered one of the richest men in the world, while the people of Zaire, they were one of the poorest. And hospitals without medicine, schools without teachers, roads that were the most potholed than pavement. But Mobutu's presidential places, oh, like those had marble floors and golden chandeliers. He even flew Concorde jets to Paris for shopping trips. And this wasn't just corruption, it was industrial scale looting with a touch of designer flair. And like I'd say that Mobutu didn't destroy the economy like Pol Pot. He hollowed it out. He built a shell of a state, flashy on the outside but crumbling inside. When his regime finally collapsed in the late 90s, it left behind a fragile, broken economy and a painful question. How much economic damage can one man do when no one dares to say no? And yeah, so now answering your question, Chanju, on like um, I think it's pretty interesting question, but I'd say that when Mobutu handed over foreign-owned businesses to his loyalists who lacked experience, like many industries collapsed. Agriculture, mining, and manufacturing all took major hits, and as production dropped, supply of goods fell, but the demand remained the same, leading to the price increase. And another factor is like as confidence in the Zarian currency fell, its value kept depreciating. People lost faith in the money itself, which pushed prices even higher as sellers demanded more currency to compensate for the lost value. And investors, both domestic and foreign, fled due to unpredictability and mismanagement. And without investment, productivity stayed low and inflation stayed high. So, Chanju, in short, I'd say that Mobutu's regime tried to fix rising prices with temporary patches like price controls and currency adjustments, but inflation is a symptom. His government was feeding the disease like corruption, inefficiency, and economic sabotage. So, yeah.
Mr. Suprit Nagala, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
I would love to, but unfortunately, my internet's not working right now.
No worries, Mr. Nagala. Everyone's having an internet difficulty today, and for the audience, Suprit is actually in Bangalore right now in his grandparents' house, which is sort of in the outskirts of the city. So he's facing internet difficulties right now. So with that being said, I would like to briefly talk and give more statistics about Mobutu Sese's regime in the Democratic People's Republic of Congo. So I would like to talk about the economic decline and the GDP loss. So there's GDP per capita fell from around 260 dollars in 1965, which is the year Mobutu took power, to about $100 in 1997 when Mobutu was ousted. So this drastic decline underscores the extent of the economic mismanagement during his 32 years in power. And Zaire's overall GDP growth was stagnated during Mobutu's rule, while the economy shrinking by approximately 5% annually during 1980s and 1990s further shows the level of economic catastrophic that sort of took place. And the country's economic collapse was marked by widespread poverty, with over 80% of the population living below the poverty line by the time Mobutu was ousted. And Mobutu's regime was heavily reliant on foreign aids and loans, as I mentioned before. From the late 1960s to the 1990s, Zaire received an estimated $10 billion in foreign aid, much of which was misused or diverted to personal enrichment. And despite receiving large amount of foreign aid, Zaire's external debt of $13 billion by 1997, while Mobutu continued to amass wealth abroad, just goes on to show the wealth disparity as well as the heavy corruption that happened. And other than that, I would like to talk about the accumulation of personal fortune of around $4 billion to $5 billion by the time Mobutu was ousted, and his wealth was sort of derived from controlling key sectors of the economy, including mining, oil, transportation, siphoning of national resources into Swiss bank accounts. And the declining in the key industries is the most important part. Zaire was one of the world's largest producers of copper, cobalt, and diamonds by the late 80s, but these industries saw a sharp decline. For example, the copper production in Zaire dropped from 450 tons to around 50,000 tons by 1997. So in 1970, it was around 450 tons, and in 1997, it was 50,000 tons. So that's like around what? That's like around nine times the decline in copper production in Zaire, and we all know that Zaire sort of was heavily reliant on export, so export revenue sort of dropped as well, and unemployment was the biggest sector which was hit, because it's estimated that 70% of the population was unable to find stable jobs, and majority of the people sought after government jobs. For example, in Bangladesh, we have BCS, which is the Bangladesh Civil Service, and majority of the bureaucrats in our country, they sort of like majority of the people, they want to bureaucrats in this country, and they sort of take the BCS exam in Bangladesh, which is like the heavily sought after job. And the in 2024 August, when the previous prime minister was sort of facing the protest and everything, majority of it came from the fact that people couldn't like apply for government jobs because so many people were applying. There's like what 20 500 seats, and then like there's like 500,000 people applying for it. So clearly unemployment was the reason. Bangladesh saw political tension, and the same can be said in Zaire as well, because in 1990s, when unemployment had soared to 70%, all the people were in the streets. And as I've mentioned before, there's a very famous lieutenant there was a very famous lieutenant in there named Lohan Desihe Kabila, who sort of was sort of supported by the people. So clearly, based on the statistics, Mobutu Sese Seko had clearly, even though he claimed to be a nationalistic guy, he clearly had no sense of nationalism, as annual inflation sort of reached 1,000% in 1993, and the hyperinflation continued to erode people's savings and sort of the purchasing power, and the collapse of any formal economic activity in the country also led to unemployment. So, with that being said, I had a question for Mr. Chanjoo Kim and Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Supreet Nagela. So, given the vast sums of foreign aid, that Mobutu received during his rule, and the international community support for him during the Cold War, how do you guys assess the role of foreign powers in perpetuating kleptocratic regimes? Could this be seen as a failure of international responsibility, and what steps could be taken to prevent such economic collapse? Mr. Chanjoo Kim, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Supreet Nagala?
Okay, so Arif Malik, such a deep and insightful question you have brought up. Okay, so as you already explained, Mobutu Sese Seko's entire rule was a case study in how foreign interference can sustain, corrupt, and destroy a nation. And the US, France, Belgium, and these other powers didn't just tolerate Mobutu, they propped him up because he served their interest. They funneled billions into Zaire not to develop the country but to keep Mobutu in power as a Cold War pawn against Soviet influence in Africa. So, what was the result? A dictator who amassed a fortune of over $5 billion while his people starved. So, is foreign intervention always bad? Not necessarily. There are cases where international aid and intervention can do good. For instance, Marshall Plan style investments in post war Europe worked, and the US helped rebuild South Korea and Japan into economic powerhouses. But what's the difference? Those countries had accountability, strong institutions, and weren't just puppets like Maputo. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, we've also seen aid used as a tool for control by China or the US rather than actual development. And money flows into dictatorships with no oversight, and leaders can use it to buy loyalty, oppress their own people, and stash billions in Swiss banks while their countries remain impoverished, just like what we saw with the Humbo Tota port in Sri Lanka. So, how do we prevent this? How do we prevent just one power being propped up by foreign interference and becoming too powerful like Mobuto? And how do we instead use foreign aid to create countries like economic powerhouses like South Korea or Japan? So the biggest thing is to stop treating authoritarian leaders as strategic partners, because just because they serve short-term interests, this doesn't mean they will be good on the long term. The world keeps on making this mistake as well. Mobutu, Karimov, Saddam, and even today with Gulf monarchies. It can be argued this is definitely a debated topic, but we need to stop prioritizing stability over democracy and human rights. Number two, tying aid to real accountability. Because if foreign aid is needed, it should be tied to clear reforms and transparency, not just blank checks to corrupt regimes. Because this would ensure that the money actually goes into infrastructure, healthcare, education, and not just to the ruling elite. And finally, we must strengthen the local institutions with the foreign aid and foreign interference, you could say. And it shouldn't just serve the foreign interests. And this would mean that countries, global powers, need to come out of a completely selfish motive and try to actually desire for the other person or the other country's good. So instead of focusing on who's in charge, they should focus on building strong local institutions. And in this way, you would be able to empower civil society, courts, and a free press where dictators cannot just siphon off foreign aid unchecked. So, uh, in essence, I hope this answers your question, Arib, and I definitely invite Chanjo or Shazib to briefly answer the question as well if you would like to.
Okay, so I'll like really briefly answer the question. Like, so how could we like prevent this kind of repeating mistakes of Zaire? So the global financial system should do more to prevent stolen funds from being hidden in the foreign banks, as yeah Mobutu did, and stronger international cooperation is needed to hold the leaders accountable for the corruption and economic mismanagement. Yeah, so generally, foreign powers played a major role in enabling Mobutu's kleptocracy and prioritizing short-term political gain over the long-term welfare of Zaire. So yeah, only through yeah, I think this is all.
Thank you, everyone, for your great insight. So, undoubtedly, Mr. Chandra Kim, Mr. Suprit Nagel, and Mr. Shazib Kareem for the insight. So, undoubtedly, we can see that Mobutu's regime was clearly marked by heavy corruption, and by the fact that he simply did not care enough about the economic sort of development of his country, which led to Zaire becoming one of the poorest countries, not only in the world but also in Africa, despite having such a plentiful, bountiful resources, as well as plenty of human resources, not just natural resources. So with that being said, I would like to move into the third big brother for today, which is Islam Karimov. So Islam Karimov is the former president of Uzbekistan who ruled from 1991, which is the time period when the USSR was dismantled by Gorbachev, I believe. And Karimov's economic policies were marked by authoritarian control, focus on state-owned enterprises, and the exploitation of Uzbekistan's natural resources, all of which had a significant economic and social consequences for the country. And his rule is often characterized by repression, human rights violations, and efforts to maintain a firm grip on power at any cost. So I would like to talk and give a brief introduction on Karimov's economic policies, its impact on Uzbekistan, as well as his long-lasting legacy. So first of all, Uzbekistan is a country which is located in Central Asia, and it's bordered by Turkmenistan to the south, Tajikistan to the east, Kyrgyzstan as well, I believe, and then Kazakhstan to the north. So Uzbekistan is known for the Silk Road and the major city route known as Samarkand, which I believe everyone, all of us read during social studies last year. No, I mean in grade 8, and it's basically like a landlocked country in Central Asia. So its geography is very important. So clearly it's landlocked and it doesn't have any sort of plentiful natural resources like there. However, Karimov's government pursued policies of economic isolation, even though the country itself is very isolated as it is landlocked. And this economic isolation throughout was sort of prevalent throughout its rule. So he sought to keep Uzbekistan largely self-sufficient and avoid full integration into the global economy. And this meant limiting foreign investment and trade relations, and often rejecting for Western-oriented reforms that could undermine his regime's control. And as a result, the country missed out on significant foreign capital and technology that could have spurred economic growth. And Karimov maintained strict control over key sectors of the economy. The government controlled essential industries, especially in the cotton production and natural gas. And Uzbekistan became one of the world's largest producers of cotton, but Karimov's policies led to inefficiencies and exploitation within these industries. For example, in cotton, the government controlled 90% of the cotton sector, including the collection and sale of cotton. And this left very little room for private enterprise and stifled any entrepreneurial growth outside the state-run sphere. Additionally, there was forced labor and human rights violation. One of the most notorious aspects of Karimov's economic policies was the use of forced labor in Uzbekistan's cotton industry. Every year, hundreds and thousands of people, including children and high school students, were forced to work in the cotton fields, often under harsh conditions, to meet state quotas. Human rights organizations and the United Nations repeatedly condemned the use of forced labor. And according to reports, as I was reading, about 1 million people were forced into the cotton fields annually, a practice that continued throughout Karimov's rule. And despite international pressure, the Uzbek government did not fully abandon this practice during his time in power. And while forced labor is a very well-known issue, international bodies like the World Bank and the ILO, which is the International Labor Organization, only increased pressure on Uzbekistan later in Karimov's regime. However, it was clear that economic growth in this sector came at the cost of human working in these grueling conditions in the cotton fields. And other than that, I would also like to talk about some of the economic reforms and failures. So, after gaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, Karimov maintained a policy of gradual economic reforms, focusing on preserving state control. And rather than embracing rapid privatization and market reforms, which are typical of post-Soviet transition, Uzbekistan took a more cautious approach, which Karimov justified as a means of avoiding economic instability. So, first, I would like to talk about the privatization. While other post-Soviet states began privatizing their state-owned industries, like for example Ukraine, Karimov took a more conservative approach, and only limited privatization occurred, and much of the country's economy remained state-controlled, particularly in strategic sectors like energy, transport, and agriculture. And as for currency and exchange rate issues, Karimov regime also kept a rigid exchange rate system and control the national currency, which is the som. And the policy was clearly disastrous, because if a government tries to control a state's currency, it often leads to the currency sort of being overvalued than what it actually is. So this policy resulted in a black market for currency and severe discrepancy between the official exchange rate and the market rate, leading to a high inflation and a lack of foreign currency in the country. And inflation was very high as well, because it averaged around 15% per annum. contributing to the shrinking population's purchasing power and stifling the development of the middle class. And this was exacerbated by frequent government interventions in the economy, such as restrictions on foreign aid, which led to inefficiencies in the market. And as for natural resource management, Uzbekistan is, even though it's landlocked, it's pretty rich in natural resources, particularly cotton and natural gas. And under Karimov, the government pursued policies of export driven growth in these sectors, but they were marked by mismanagement and over reliance on commodity sectors. Cotton, for instance, remained Uzbekistan's largest export, contributing significantly to currency earnings. But this over dependence on one commodity left the economy vulnerable to price fluctuations. And the same was true for natural gas exports, which saw declining revenues due to global shifts in energy markets and the inability to attract foreign investment in the energy sector. Not only that, Karimov's reluctance to diversify Uzbekistan's economy beyond agriculture and energy proved to be a serious hindrance. The lack of industrial development meant that Uzbekistan's economy remained highly dependent on a few sectors, which ultimately stunted the growth of other industries like manufacturing, technology, and services. And no surprise, there were wealth inequality, however, not as bad of a wealth inequality as Zer. And other than that, legacy wise, while Uzbekistan's economy showed growth during the early 2000s due to high commodity prices, which was not due to Karimov but due to the fact that the world sort of was shifting to a more tech sector. So commodities like natural gas was reliant. And by the end of Karimov's reign, the economy was showing signs of stagnation. So post Karimov's death in 2016, his successor Shavkat Mirziyoyev began to implement economic reforms aimed at liberalizing the economy. However, many of the structural issues inherited during Karimov's era over the overdependence on cotton continues to impact Uzbekistan's economy. So even though Karimov was a sort of authoritarian leader who sort of failed to diversify the economy, while researching, I could not find any sort of viable like sources to prove his corruption. So even though like no doubt he was a dictator who sort of left a legacy of forced labor, mismanagement of natural resources, and sort of economic stagnation. He, in my opinion, he was sort of still better than Mobutu Sese Seko and Pol Pot, as he economy did not necessarily decline during his reign, but the currency did lose its value. So, what do you guys think about Islam Karimov's reign and its impact on Uzbekistan? Mr. Shazib Karim, Mr. Suprit Nagal, and Mr. Chanjoo, if you could please provide some insights into this matter as well.
Yeah, sure. So, Ari, thank you for the introduction on our last Big Brother, and yeah, adding my own perspective. I'd say that uh, and talking about Uzbekistan, like from 1989 until his death in 2016, Karimov ruled Uzbekistan with all the warmth of a Soviet era typewriter. He promised order, he delivered it, with repression, censorship, and a command economy that moved at a glacial pace. But unlike Pol Pot or Mobutu, Karimov wasn't trying to destroy the economy, he was trying to freeze it in time. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many newly independent states embraced market liberalization, privatization, and reform. But Karimov, he said, not so fast. He kept tight control over the Uzbek economy. Currency was heavily restricted, and imports and exports were micromanaged. And the state monopolized key sectors like cotton, energy, and gold. Why? Because control equals power. And for Karimov, nothing was more valuable than total stability. But this stability came at a cost, a big one. Cotton, for instance, remained the country's economic backbone, but instead of mechanized farming, Uzbekistan's government relied on forced labor. Yes, even children had to harvest. Every year, students, teachers, doctors were pulled from their schools and jobs to pick cotton under the scorching sun. The world condemned it, and Karimov shrugged. Productivity didn't matter, obedience did. Foreign investment extremely limited, innovation stifled. Entrepreneurs were viewed with suspicion. The underground economy became more dynamic than the legal one. And still, if you look at the numbers, you'd be tempted to say like it wasn't that bad. Because the GDP growth was steady, inflation remained under control, and debt levels were low. But those numbers were tightly controlled, like everything else in Uzbekistan. This was an economy that functioned but couldn't evolve. So I'd say that like in the bigger picture, Karimov's Uzbekistan was a paradox, an economy that worked just enough to prevent collapse, but never enough to thrive. It was efficient in being inefficient and dangerously allergic to change. His rule shows that economic stagnation doesn't always come from chaos. and sometimes it comes from a ruler who values silence over progress. So, Islam Karimov's legacy, it was a controlled economy, a muzzled society, and a cautionary tale. When a regime fears change more than failure, it locks itself and its people into a permanent holding pattern.
Mr. Chanjoo Kim or Mr. Subit Nagala, would you like to chime in? Yes, Mr. Chanjoo Kim.
Okay, so Islam Karimov had a clear vision to build a self-reliant, centrally managed economy. And for over 2 decades, he kept tight control over nearly every sector. But what did this mean for industrial development in this country? So let's break it down. So first and foremost, Uzbekistan's economy under Karimov was driven by state-controlled industries, and many of which followed a legacy of Soviet-style planning. One of the cornerstones was cotton, often referred as white gold. Just like Arif said before, cotton was Uzbekistan's main export for years, but the state controlled every aspect of it, from production and pricing to export profits. Farmers were forced to sell their cottons to the government at a price far below the market rates. And during the harvest, thousands of teachers, students, even doctors were sent into the fields as forced labor. It brought in revenue, but at the tremendous social cost. Then there's a gold. Uzbekistan is actually one of the world's top 10 gold producer, home to massive Muruntaw gold mine, one of the largest open pit mine on earth. Gold mining, along with natural gas and uranium, was ran entirely by state-owned companies like Navoy Mining and Uzbek Neftegas. Yeah, these industries made significant contribution to the economy, but profits were centralized, and corruption thrived in the absence of transparency or competition. Another flagship project was of the country was to automobile industry. In the mid 90s, Uzbekistan partnered with South Korea's Daewoo to create domestic car manufacturer, what would later become GM Uzbekistan. It was a point of national pride, and people were riding Uzbek-made cars, and thousands of jobs were created. But again, high traffic tr- tariffs protected these companies from competition. The result: expensive, low-quality vehicles that struggle to compete outside of Uzbekistan. Despite heavy investments in sectors like textiles, fertilizers, and chemicals, much of industrial infrastructures were outdated, relying on old Soviet machinery. Innovations were stifled, and private businesses were discouraged. Everything required government approval. There was little room for risk, entrepreneurship, or growth. Foreign investors, most of them stayed away. Strict currency controls, trade barriers, and reputation for arbitrary, arbitrary legal decision made Uzbekistan a tough place to the business. So, in conclusion, the state provided a job and kept the economy afloat and avoided the chaotic transition that some of other former Soviet republics experienced. But it also locked Uzbekistan into a rigid system. So I would like to ask a question for your in so could the preservation of Soviet style state enterprises be seen as strength or a weakness of the Karimov's economic model?
Mr. Shazim Karim, I see that a hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, Chandra, could you please repeat your question?
Yeah, sure. Could the preservation of Soviet-style state enterprises be seen as strength or the weakness of Karimov's economic model?
So yeah, Chanju, to answer your question briefly here, I think like it could be seen as a double-edged sword. There's always the strengths and weaknesses in both sides of the story, but um some, but like most people would say that it'd be leaning towards more of like a weakness of his regime and his rule, because as we had previously talked about, like he had really harsh regulations, and like from the outside it did seem like everything was going well, but internally they were having a lot of issues, and things like weren't going as planned. The citizens didn't feel at home, like they didn't feel they weren't treated as humans, like Karimov's regime, it was all about obedience. So yeah, Chanjo, I'd say that it was like it had a lot of weaknesses in, like his style of rule had a lot of weaknesses, and it really isolated the citizens of his nation.
That was such an interesting question, Chanju, and also a very interesting answer by you, Shazib. And me personally, I don't think I couldn't have said it any better. So, what I wanted to also talk about was also uh, Karimov and how he exploded 9/11. Because you see, 9/11 changed the world. It reshaped foreign policy, created entire wars, and gave governments across the globe a blank check for repression, as long as they called it fighting terrorism. And no one played that game better than Islam Karimov. Now, before 9/11, Uzbekistan wasn't exactly on Washington's radar. Karimov had been running the country since the fall of the Soviet Union, building up a classic strongman dictatorship. Torture, political prison camps, zero opposition. But after the Twin Towers fell, all he had to do was rebrand his repression as counterterrorism, and suddenly he had a full backing of the United States. Karimov sold Uzbekistan as a frontline state against radical Islam. The US needed military bases in Central Asia for the invasion of Afghanistan, and Karimov handed them the Karshi Kanabad Airbase K2, as the US military called it. And in return, America funneled hundreds of millions in aid straight into his government, no questions asked. And you never know, most probably he did not use that aid for its main purpose of aid, and most of it probably went through many people's pockets through corruption. But here's the kicker. Karimov's version of fighting terrorism wasn't just about stopping Al Qaeda. It was about crushing any form of opposition. If you criticized the government, you were branded an extremist, and if you practiced Islam outside of state control, you were a terrorist. And thousands were arrested, tortured, some literally boiled alive in prison. And this was all of Karimov's strategy to ensure that there was no opposition to bring him back down onto the ground. So the big question is, did the US know? Absolutely. There were reports, human rights groups were screaming about it. But as long as Karimov kept the bases open, the West looked the other way. And it wasn't until 2005, when Uzbek troops massacred hundreds of protesters in Andijan, that the US finally pulled back. By then, though, Karimov had already secured Russian and Chinese backing, and he did not need the US anymore. So this just, like, it's just a rhetorical question. How much responsibility does the US have in propping up brutal regimes like Karimov's, and why is the US always interfering in other countries and sidelining humanitarian problems just for their own benefit? And that's obviously very selfish, as many people die and are massacred in persecution as well.
Thank you, Supreet, for that question. So yeah, clearly, there's a correlation that we can see, like the U.S. supporting regimes, but obviously it's for the interest of the U.S. So for conclusion today, for Big Brothers and their economies, I would like to talk about briefly give a summary of the Pol Pot, Mobutu Sese Seko, and Islam Karimov. So Pol Pot regime was sort of radical in the way that it wanted to transform Cambodia into a rural, agrarian, and classless society through the agricultural revolution. And clearly, economically speaking, it was a disaster. It sort of isolated Cambodia, and through the 4 years that Pol Pot reigned, 25% of the population was massacred. So clearly, Pol Pot, from an economic standpoint, he didn't know at all what he was doing, and he wasn't incentivized for corruption as well. He simply was a madman in the sense that he wanted to kill people. For Mobutu Sese Seko, he sort of knew what he was doing. He was corrupted, and not for not he was corrupt, and he wanted everything not for the interest of the country, but for self-interest. And through Zarenization, he attempted to sort of nationalize all the industries and take control, which led to the highly centralized and corrupt system in Zaire. And clearly economically speaking, the Democratic Republic of Congo is still one of the poorest countries in Africa, as Mobutu's rule in Zaire has left a legacy of extreme corruption. And lastly, for Islam Karimov, he wasn't a corrupt leader. However, he was very, very authoritarian, and he maintained a state-controlled economy with a focus on cotton production and natural gas exports. And while the economy sort of stagnated, it didn't necessarily decline, other than the fact that there was high inflation and poverty rates. Reached around 27% by the time of his death. So, due to the economic stagnation, the GDP per capita remained low. However, widespread corruption, even though Karimov himself wasn't that much involved, the bureaucrats in his government were. So corruption remained entrenched. And legacy-wise, it has left economic stagnation and human rights abuses. However, if we're talking about human rights, in my opinion, Pol Pot was the most disastrous. Then Sese Seko and Islam Karimov. And for economically speaking, in terms of who ran the economy best, I mean, no one did in particular, but comparatively speaking, Islam Karimov was sort of the one leading in economy, then Mobutu Sese Seko, and then Pol Pot. So is that something that everyone agrees with?
Yeah, I would agree with that conclusion.
I completely agree with you.
Same.
Thank you, everyone, for your agreement. So yeah, that's the conclusion for Big Brothers and their economies. Pol Pot, Mobutu Sese Seko, and Islam Karimov, and we did a comparative analysis on their governance, human rights abuses, and economic management, as well as talked about the authoritarian traits and their long-lasting consequences of their rule. So, Mr. Chanjoo Kim, before we depart for today, would you like to give your experiences in being in the Dollar Dialogue podcast, and could you like briefly give a conclusion on your experience today before we depart for today?
Okay, so it was really an amazing time to talk about this really interesting topic with you, as it was my big dream, and I think I gained a significant amount of knowledge about these big brothers and their economics. And yeah, thank you very much to Mr. Arim Malik, Mr. Shaz Karim, and Mr. Suprit Nagela.
Thank you, Mr. Chanjoo Kim. So, yes, to the audience, this is the end of the podcast, episode 43, Big Brothers and the Economist, Pol Pot, Mobutu Sese Seko, and Islam Karimov with Chanjoo Kim. So, thank you to the audience for listening in for today, and we'll see you next time with another very interesting topic and with another very interesting guest speaker. Goodbye.